Lecture 11, on Ethics, Contemporary Moral Problems. Conscience, Applied Ethics 3. Since we will be returning, in part, to the moral theorizing of St. Thomas Aquinas, it will be beneficial to review Lecture 5 since it provides the context for some of his more nuanced reasoning which we will evaluate here. Indeed, the ideas presented in this lecture are difficult to wrestle with and even more difficult if the earlier foundational principles are not fresh in our minds. 1. Introduction. Our text begins with the presupposition that everyone, at some time or another, has talked about their conscience. I suppose this is a safe assumption for most people since, after all, the concept of a guilty conscience is quite common. However, in introductory material, it may be prudent to provide some explanation instead of presupposing a common conception that some may not possess. In this chapter, we will be discussing the conscience and conscientiousness. These are sometimes confused with conscious and consciousness. There are mountains of philosophical and psychological literature on each of these terms, so a thorough treatment of each is impossible here. Instead, we will introduce each generally, only to the degree of detail necessary to use these terms as intended by our text. To begin with the latter terms, we can make it through this chapter successfully using the common understanding of the terms conscious as meaning aware of and able to respond to our surroundings, and consciousness as the state of being conscious. Conscience, on the other hand, is our internal dialogue, or feeling, that guides us toward what is right and away from what is wrong. In its most basic sense, conscientiousness can be thought of as the quality, or condition, of a person that gives them the ability to understand and act in accordance with the dictates of conscience. As our text notes, the concept of conscience has changed over the centuries, and can be found in both religious and secular schools of thought. As examples, this chapter will focus on two historical perspectives on conscience, that of St. Thomas Aquinas, as a religiously motivated example, and that of Sigmund Freud, as a secular example. 2. The history of conscience. While there doesn't seem to be a term directly translatable to conscience in ancient Greek philosophy, Plato's psychological theories, as discussed in his famous work, The Republic, arguably contain a conception of conscientiousness. According to Plato's psychology, a person's mind, or soul, is comprised of at least three faculties or principles, namely, the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive principles of the soul. The rational soul is interested in wisdom and the good, the spirited principle is interested in honor and glory, and the appetitive principle is interested in lesser desires such as physical pleasure. The principle of motion in the tripartite soul belongs to the appetitive principle and outweighs the rational principle of the soul. However, the spirited principle is reasons responsive and can reign in the appetitive soul to listen to the dictates of the rational principle, so long as the soul is properly balanced. To be virtuous, people must train themselves to habitually ensure that their appetites, the appetitive principle, are in accordance with reason, the rational principle. When appetites for what is wrong are overcome by reason, we may feel a sense of pride in ourselves for our accomplishments. However, when we give in to our appetites for what is wrong, we may feel shame. These feelings of pride and shame are the domain of the spirited principle of the soul. So the spirited principle tries to steer our appetites to be in accordance with reason. Because the spirited principle is primarily interested in honor and glory, it does not want to feel the shame of giving in to our appetites because that is an experience of failure. Once we are habituated to only desire that which is in accordance with reason, we have become virtuous, and the soul is satisfied as a whole because it is in proper balance. This balance is indicative of the virtue temperance, or sophrosune, which is arguably identical with conceptions of conscientiousness in modern psychology. However, our text correctly points out that conscience, as we currently conceive of it, developed out of Christian traditions of thought, such as in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, and later by Martin Luther during his break from Catholicism. As said in Lecture 5, Aquinas' views developed from the study of Plato and Aristotle with religious motivations, and our common understanding of conscience developed, in part, from Aquinas' views, so it is not unusual to notice overlap when we work through these theories. As our text claims, there seems to be at least three functions that the conscience has in our lives. The first noted is that the conscience seems to guide us in our actions and moral deliberations, the second is that it seems to serve as a source for moral knowledge, the third is that it serves as a form of motivation. The ever-popular example of the Nazis and tyrants is used again in this chapter to contrast the first two functions of conscience. A tyrant's conscience may guide their actions to commit atrocities, but that would call the second function into question, since a legitimate source of moral knowledge wouldn't conclude that atrocities are morally acceptable. Our text also questions the efficacy of conscience as a moral guide, since we sometimes fail to follow our consciences. Different thinkers will explain this phenomenon in different ways, as we will see, and have seen already in our discussion of Plato's psychology. 3. Aquinas on conscience. Aquinas has a nuanced and complicated conception of conscience. It seems that, for Aquinas, conscience dictates what we ought to do or ought to have done in the past in light of moral knowledge we acquire through reason or divine revelation, such as scriptures. Conscience, therefore, appears instead to be an effective guide for specific courses of action, or in Aquinas' words, the application of knowledge to activity. Aquinas seems to claim that our conscience comes to recognize moral courses of action based on knowledge we acquire from reason and scriptures through a natural tendency of the human mind called synderesis. Synderesis, an even more obscure term, seems to refer to an inborn tendency, or habit of the mind, to drive us toward what is good and repel us from what is bad. When our text says that, unlike conscience, synderesis is never mistaken, I take that to mean that synderesis is never wrong because it is right to pursue the good and wrong to pursue the bad. The moral mistakes we make are the result of the conscience misapplying the moral knowledge we acquire through reason and from divine revelation. As conscience and synderesis are based in reason, errors of conscience are based in two types of ignorance, namely, vincible ignorance and invincible ignorance. Vincible ignorance is the kind that, when we do err, we ought to have known better because we could have figured it out had we done our due diligence. For example, our text has us consider a gun store owner who sells weapons to a customer who, according to a background check, has a violent criminal record. Had this customer proceeded to harm others with the purchased weapons, we could say that the gun store owner ought to have known better because he could have figured out that selling the weapons to the criminal was a bad idea. However, if an apparently stable and law-abiding citizen had purchased the weapons and committed the same crimes, then the gun store owner would have had no way of knowing an atrocity would have resulted from the sale, hence, invincible ignorance. Some notable similarities between Aquinas and Plato's theories, though, as our text points out, the ancient Greeks didn't seem to have a word for conscience. The spirited principle of the soul on Plato's view serves similar purposes to Aquinas' conscience in that they both approve and disapprove of potential and previous actions. Also, as conscience and synderesis are rational aspects of the mind on Aquinas' view, so too is Plato's rational principle of the soul, both of which aim towards the good and avoid what is wrong. However, as we will see in the next section, as the concept of conscience developed over the centuries, there were changes around a few common threads that remained in philosophical and common conceptions of conscience. For Freud and the conscience, Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist who made significant contributions to the development of modern psychology. Though many of his ideas have not stood the test of time, that does not diminish the importance of his contributions. Similar to Plato's theory, Freud also argues for a tripartite structure of the mind or soul. The previously discussed appetitive principle of the soul from Plato's theory is relevantly analogous to what Freud called the id. The id, like the appetitive principle, is primarily concerned with satisfying appetites through pleasure. Freud refers to the id's drive as the pleasure principle. However, the remaining principles are not as symmetrical as the appetitive principle is with the id, though they do enjoy some similarities. For example, the ego experiences the punishment of shame upon moral failing from the conscience, just as the spirited principle of the soul does. However, it does not seem to be the case that the spirited principle receives this punishment from the rational principle of the soul any more than it could be a self-contained and self-imposed punishment, based on its own recognition of moral failure. While the ego and the spirited principle do both try to tame the id, or appetitive principle, it is not clear that the spirited principle is the seat of conscious awareness, as appears to be the case with the ego, on Freud's view. Above the ego is the so-called superego, which, again, may not be symmetrical with Plato's rational principle of the soul. The superego seems to be a point of theoretical divergence for Plato, Aquinas, and Freud alike. For Plato, moral knowledge is certainly in the wheelhouse of the rational principle of the soul, but it is not clear whether it is the seat of the conscience or conscious awareness. The same could be argued for Aquinas. However, on his view, moral knowledge comes from reason and God, not the perfect forms that Plato postulated. For Freud, the superego that contains the conscience is rational, but moral knowledge does not come from forms or God, but from experience. The experiences that give content for our conscience to blame or praise our actions are purported to be the rules, mandates, and chastisement we receive from authority figures such as parents, religious leaders, and from social norms, practices, and laws. As we grow older, we internalize some of these and they give an authoritative voice to our conscience. Volumes could be, and indeed have been, written regarding the psychological theories of Plato, Aquinas, and Freud, and how they compare with one another. However, what is presented here and in our text are the most basics of these theories and will suffice for the successful completion of this course of study. 5. Freud's psychosexual development theory. In the previous section we briefly discussed how the conscience is formed in the superego and its role in moderating behavior. However, Freud's theories are also intended to explain what leads to the development of psychologically stable and unstable individuals. When the superego is well developed by healthy experiences, the conscience will dictate that the ego allows the id a healthy amount of freedom. Similar to Aristotle's triadic conception of vice and virtue, Freud's superego conscience can fall victim to excess and defect. For example, if the conscience is not developed properly, it may not impose enough restrictions on the id through the ego, leading to overindulgence in any number of unhealthy forms. Conversely, the conscience can also be maldeveloped to be overly stringent, thus, repressing the id to the point that the individual develops any number of unhealthy neuroses. Since Freud seems to see sex as the primary psychological motivator in human psychology, he developed what our text refers to as Freud's psychosexual development theory. Among other things, this theory is intended to explain the development of the conscience. The first stage of development, on this theory, is the oral stage, which lasts from birth to age 1.5. In this stage, the baby's id is satisfied by putting things in their mouth. Freud claims that habits like smoking, chewing gum, and overeating are developed later in life as a result of failing to fully develop the id through this stage. The next stage is the anal stage. This stage is about gaining control over one's body to the extent that one can choose when and where to use the restroom and is supposedly when the baby's ego is developed. The anal stage lasts from 1.5 to 3 years of age. If this stage is maldeveloped, a person can become out of control or over-controlling, depending on whether the development was excessive or deficient. The next stage is the phallic stage, from age 3 to 6, where children learn that there are differences between male and female genitalia. It is during this stage that Freud believed we develop the Oedipus and Electra complex. The latency stage is so called because from 6 years old to about puberty human sexuality, what Freud referred to as libido, is latent or hidden. At this stage, sexual desires are either repressed or have not yet developed. Boys and girls will learn social norms and roles by primarily playing with other children of the same sex. Freud seems to believe that maldevelopment in the latency stage leads to problems with relationships and understanding one's gender. The mature genital stage is the final stage that lasts until death. In this stage after puberty, we become sexual beings seeking relationships, pleasure, and happiness. This is also when we acquire a fully developed conscience. 6. Summary. As our text says, the notion of conscience has appeared for thousands of years in different cultures, even though it has not always been called conscience. Modern Christian orthodoxy popularized it and characterized it in relation to God's voice and guidance. Aquinas thought that conscience is the way we understand how to apply what we know. In Aquinas' view, our conscience is fallible and might guide us wrongly. When our conscience gets it wrong, we can be either culpable, through vincible ignorance, or not culpable, through invincible ignorance. Freud is less convinced that conscience is a force for good, and he is certain that it has not got anything to do with God. For Freud, conscience can be either a good or bad. We can think of our mind as having three parts: the id, ego, and superego. The conscience for Freud is the form the superego takes when it is trying to keep the ego in line. It is internalized as the voice of authority. The superego is about following rules, but those rules do not come from on high, they derive from the upbringing we have had. So, if we have had a repressive upbringing, then the superego, the voice of conscience, will be repressive. How we develop these three features of the mind is through what Freud calls psychosexual development. If we do not develop correctly, then we become fixated and repressive, form a neurosis, and ultimately become mentally ill. Freud thought that this could be avoided by working through the psychosexual stages in the normal way and can be treated through psychosexual counseling. 7. Questions and tasks. While the issues to consider section of our text asks 12 interesting questions, please at least answer the following before next time. 1. Do you think you have a conscience? What does it tell you? 2. Do you think that everyone ultimately knows, if they reason correctly, what is right and wrong? 3. How does Freud's account of conscience relate to his psychosexual development theory? 4. Could it ever make sense to talk about animals, robots having a conscience? If not, why not?